Some time ago, I talked about Ephesians chapter 4, verses 17 to 24. I actually expanded a lot of those verses for us. It was earlier on in our study. And I'm looking at those again today. I'm actually going a little bit deeper, using a bit more application to see how those things can be applied in our life. I'm not going to read those verses in their entirety here and now, for the simple reason that I forgot to write them down, so I don't have them with me. But they'll certainly be on the site there, under the video, and you can read them, or you can read them in your own Bible. But what I am going to do is I'm going to paraphrase those verses. After studying them again for a while, what I did was I put them into my own words in a way that can be understood in a different way, so that you can read them and think about them perhaps differently to what you read them in or in the Word. Not that the meaning would be any different, but simply just maybe the wording. Sometimes it helps to read things in a different way, helps us to understand deeper in a way. So I'm not going to read the paraphrase in its entirety here either. That as well is on the site under the video, so you can read that for yourself too. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to expound some of what I wrote in the paraphrase, so that you can understand a little bit more what I'm trying to say, and you can also let that go deeper into your thinking and maybe apply some of that to your life. So what Paul was saying in these verses was that there was a time in our lives before we were saved that we didn't have much control over our minds, that our minds were subject to wandering, subject to perverseness, to passivity and weakness, totally different to what we can achieve right now after having been saved. The word does say that we have the mind of Christ, and that's perfectly true. But we do need to learn and grow in that and apply those things to our lives. But before we were saved, it was a different story. We had a completely different way of thinking. We never would have thought or even believed about heavenly things. We may not have even had the capacity to even imagine heavenly things. And we were certainly blind to the truth and very insensitive to what was good and what was evil. We didn't really know the difference, even though our conscience might have told us what the difference was, or even our parents might have told us. There was still an insensitivity to that. And we were subject to all these things. Now, it would vary a lot from person to person, but that is the mind of the unbeliever. And this is what Paul was saying in Ephesians chapter 4. But now we have the capacity to take absolute control over our minds, and this is very important that we do so. Then, after explaining about these things about the mind, Paul goes on to say, but you have not so learned Christ, if indeed you have learned of him. So he was actually giving a condition here, that we have the capacity to learn a different way, but again we need to make the choice as to whether or not we are going to make the effort to learn the right way. So what does Paul mean by you have not so learned Christ? And how do we learn Christ? Well, we learn Christ, we learn to behave the right way in Christ by obviously the word, through preaching and teaching, through discipleship with a more mature Christian. It is a learning curve. It is learning to behave in the right way. It is learning that when we got saved, we still held a residue of the old man behind in our way of thinking. And those things are not going to disappear. That old way of thinking is not going to disappear. We have to learn a new way of thinking in order to shift the old way of thinking. So that's how we learn. We learn Christ that way, by holding to the new and casting off the old. We need to take back control of our minds. Where our minds were in control of us in the old days, we now need to take back that control. So we need to deliberately choose to lay aside the old way of thinking, the old EastEnders way of thinking. I guess what we need to realise is that this old way of thinking, or these old ways of thinking, were initially shaped by the prince of this world. And right now, those ways of thinking are useless to us. Those ways of thinking are corrupt. We don't need them. And we need to make a choice to lay aside those things, cast them off like an old garment. And Paul talks about being renewed in the spirit of our mind. And I think at some point I have mentioned that the spirit of the mind is the subconscious. And the subconscious is the real us. This is where our life springs from. This is where and how we really live out of, the real us. And it's so very easy to hold on to the appropriate behaviour and the appropriate speech and the appropriate way of thinking in our consciousness at the appropriate time. And this is the kind of shallowness that can occur when we're not really aware that the true person is not in our consciousness. The true person is in the subconsciousness, the spirit of the mind. Others might call it the character. There are other terms for it as well, but basically it's that place within us that the true us lives. The true us that nobody really sees. The true us that's only evident when we're on our own with our thinking. And that can be quite scary. We can actually be quite scared of our true us, which is why so often people will continue to have the radio and the TV and are afraid of being on their own, so that they are faced with the true them. That's the place, that's the kind of person that we really are, is the one that nobody else sees but us. I hope you're not afraid of your true person. I'm not afraid of mine, but I think I used to be. And it's so easy to be afraid of who we really are if we don't work on that person and who we really are. These scriptures talk about laying aside the old man and putting on the new. So how do we put on the new man? We've talked about laying aside the old one. Just abandon the old thinking. Just decide that's not you anymore. But how do we put on the new man? Well, I like to see it like this, that I'm actually sinking back into Jesus. I'm sinking back into the new creation, into everything that I am in him. And the way I like to think of that is, do you know that game that's often played in team building retreats, where you have to stand with somebody, a friend or a colleague or a team member behind you, and you have to start to fall backwards with this person behind you, and you have to trust that they are going to catch you when you fall back. And it is totally a game of trust, or maybe we could say it's a game of faith for us as we sink back into the arms of Jesus, trusting that by his grace we are going to be able to live the new creation, the righteousness that we have as a gift, and our identity in him as we sink back into him, forsaking the old ways. So we need to learn to sink back into a new way of thinking. We need to learn to sink back into our new form, our new identity, our new creation, a creation that never existed before. We need to learn a new language. We need to learn a new way of seeing things. We need a heavenly insight. We need to really believe that we are changed. And then as we sink back into his arms and we believe those things, then that's like applying what we believe. And as we apply what we believe, then those things will be established in our minds and eventually in our subconscious, where we will automatically live from those ways and from that identity. This is what it means to put on the new man. Now, it's undergirded by learning. It's undergirded by learning Christ, by reading the Word, by listening to preaching and teaching, reading books and discipleship. But putting on the new man is an act of faith. It's a sinking back. It's a believing that he will catch us. So sinking back into him is something that we need to practice every moment of every day. We'll not get it right, of course, for maybe a long while, but the more we practice, the more we'll get used to it, in the flow, in the habit of doing that, of just sinking back into him. So I wonder if that's what we'll practice today. Practice sinking back into him, back into the arms of Jesus, knowing that he's going to catch us and give us the grace to think the right way and to behave the right way and to be our new creation self, the righteousness of Christ, exactly as we ought to be. So I want to thank you again for listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time.